าแต่พระบิดาเจ้าว่าใหญ่ยิ่งสูงสุดพระองค์ผู้ทรงสร้างฟ้าสวรรค์และแผ่นดินโลกพระองค์ผู้ทรงสร้างสรรพสิ่งทั้งปวงขอพระองค์สำหรับความรักของพระองค์ที่มีต่อข้าพระองค์ทั้งหลายทุกคนในบัดนี้ที่ข้าพเจ้ามาอยู่ที่นี่อยู่ในเกตเวย์เซมินารีซึ่งร่วมกับคณะแบปติสต์ทั้งหมดที่อยู่ที่นี่ที่พระองค์ทรงสร้างสถานบันแห่งนี้ขึ้นมาและทรงให้เราทั้งหลายที่มาอยู่ร่วมกันอยู่ที่นี่เพื่อจะมาสรรเสริญพระองค์ขอบพระคุณพระองค์สำหรับในช่วงเวลานี้เป็น International Festival ที่มีการรวมกันอยู่ที่นี่เพื่อสรรเสริญขอบพระคุณพระองค์เจ้าและเราทั้งหลายก็มารวมกันอยู่ที่นี่ด้วยความชื่นชมยินดีพระองค์ทรงเป็นพระเจ้าของเราทั้งหลายทุกคนขอพระองค์ประทานพรแก่พี่น้องเหล่านี้ทุกคนให้เขาได้รับพระพรจากพระองค์เจ้าให้เขามีสุขภาพที่ดีแข็งแรงให้การงานต่างๆที่จะกระทำในคริสตจักรหรือที่ไหนก็ตามหรือในวิทยาลัยแห่งนี้ก็ตามให้เป็นที่ชื่นชอบในน้ำพระทัยของพระองค์ด้วยขอบพระคุณพระเจ้าสำหรับทุกสิ่งขอฝากทุกๆคนที่นี่บนทรงฤทธิ์ของพระองค์ด้วยในพระนามพระมหาเยซูคริสต์เจ้าอาเมน
Dr. Ra is an associate professor of church growth and evangelism at North Park Theological Seminary. And he has extensive experience not just in the classroom, but as a church planter, as a speaker, and as a prolific writer. And we are deeply grateful to you for joining us also today. And so with that, I would like to turn our evening over to Dr. Ra as he will continue our discussion on cultural intelligence in the church, that we may be more in our ministry to the Lord as we serve one another together.
How do we respond to the changes in the world around us? One thing we did say was that we're not going to run away and hide. We're not going to flee from what's going on and go the opposite direction from where God wants us to be. But instead, we're going to make the effort to engage the world around us. And one of those ways, as I mentioned, is through the biblical practice of lament. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But what I want to do is, as I mentioned during our workshop earlier, during the panel discussion earlier, is to review this kind of three-step process of the formation of practical theology. And, you know, we get kind of systematic theology, we get biblical theology, we get kind of all different forms and expressions of theology. But I want to introduce how do we develop a practical theology. And they're kind of a three-step process that was first introduced to me by Elton Villafañe, who was a professor at Gordon Conwell and was one of the key mentors in my life around practical theology. And Elton notes that you need to do the three-step process, and if we can put that up on the screen, of clarification, conceptualization, and confrontation. That these are kind of the three categories. Sorry, this is okay, but I actually have the different slide for that. I forgot to put the different slide on that. So the clarification, conceptualization, and confrontation. Clarification is a little bit of what we did this morning, which is to understand the context. And then confrontation, again, we did a little bit of that this morning, is to understand your theology that speaks to that context. And then confrontation is the conceptualization is theology. Confrontation is the work that we do to respond to the kind of the practical ministry piece of it. So what I want to do a little bit more of today is talk about how did we get to where we are today? What is the theology that responds to it? And then in the last 15, 30 minutes or so, talk about practical ways that we can confront the questions that are facing us in cross-cultural ministry. But let's talk about clarification, and go to that next slide. This is the work of Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman, who talk about, they wrote this in the 60s and 70s, go to the previous slide, sorry, who talk about the way social systems are created. So the way they describe social systems is the way we should probably describe culture. Right? So if we were to say, how does culture get formed? And how does culture impact and influence our society and our churches and our communities? Berger and Luckman give us a really interesting paradigm. And they list three different categories. The first is the process of externalization. The second is the process of institutionalization. And the third is the category of internalization. Externalization is when you get a group of people together and people, each individual, externalizes their experience, their values, their life, their story, their history. And you can think about this as, I was a church planter for many years, think about a church plant. You get a group of people together, and as you begin to form that church, the culture of that church, the community around that church, each individual comes with their story and externalizes who they are into that system. So that's a pretty basic way of understanding how systems, cultures, communities, and values even form in our society. But there's a second part to the process that Berger and Luckman point out, which is the process of institutionalization, which means that even after the individuals who help shape the culture through externalization, the system actually continues even after those individuals have left. And again, I come from a church planning background. I got together a group of 7 people, and we talked about what kind of church we wanted to plant together. We dreamed, and we brainstormed, and we wrote down, these are the important things, and we externalized our story into the church plant and the culture of the church plant. Now, it turns out, like in many church plants, many of the founders move on. In fact, I think the number is like between 5 to 10 years, most of the founders of the church plant have moved on. So the 10th year, I actually moved on and became professor at North Park. So I was the last person of that core group to leave. But that's actually a fairly common story of the people who helped start a church, planters, oftentimes within 5 to 10 years will move on from the church. Not always the case, but oftentimes happens. But what is interesting is that the institution of the church doesn't stop just because the individuals who helped start the church goes away, right? That's the way to denominations, seminaries. So those who founded the seminary here are long gone. They're long dead. Those who founded the Southern Baptist Convention are long gone. They're long dead. But the institution then has taken on a life of its own that is external to those that helped to create the system in the first place. And that's how cultures work. Even though individuals influence a culture, the culture takes on a life of its own and is external, institutionalized, objectified outside of even the individuals to help to shape it. So this is kind of another level of understanding culture. It's not just individuals that shape culture, but it is also a system, structure, society that has taken on a life of its own. And here's the third part of the equation, which is the process of internalization. And this is oftentimes missed as well, which is once you establish this culture, a church, denomination, seminary, etc., that culture of that seminary, denomination, and church starts influencing and shaping those who come into that system. And those individuals began to internalize this institution that is external. So you see this kind of moving in a circle, where individuals externalize their values, they help form a system, but then that system forms the people that come into the system. So here's the situation around culture then. We oftentimes think we're going to fix the world's problems by simply getting good individuals to do good things, right? If we just got enough good individuals into Congress, the government would get fixed. We'll see how that works. It hasn't worked so far. We just got to get good individuals into our world, and once we do that, racism won't exist. If we just get individuals to disavow their prejudice, then racism will go away. What we ignore is that these systems and structures, whether it's the government or churches or denominations or other institutions, they are having a social system separate from these individuals. So just fixing the individuals doesn't solve the problem because the institutions have a life of its own. That's why we have to deal with the social expression of evil in the world, right? So we can say there is a problem of personal sin, no question about it. But there is also a problem of social structural sin, which also requires that we meet that evil in the same way that we confront sin in the individual, we have to confront evil in the systems and structures of the world. Are you following me? Yeah. So what Berger and Luckman lay out for us, and Berger actually was a Christian who taught at Boston University for a number of years, is pointing out that we can't just fix the problem with good individuals. Now, that's part of the equation, one of a third, but we also have to deal with the systems, structures, and cultures. And that's when we talk about cultural competency, we can't just see it through the individual lens, we also have to see it through the structural, social, systemic lens. What I want to do, though, is focus on that third element that's at the bottom, internalization. What do we end up internalizing that ends up perpetuating the system? And here's something that's interesting that I've noted, and this is not so much quantitative data versus observational data. Sometimes we are more shaped by the institutions than we shape the institutions. When we go into an institution, it is more likely that the institution will shape us rather than we change the system. Maybe the example of this is an old movie starring Jimmy Stewart called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And he's a good guy who wants to change the world, but he actually gets sucked into the system. We've seen this over and over again, where good people try to do good work within a system and structure, but the system and structure eats them up. And so part of the problem is not just dealing with the systems and structures, but how sometimes, even when we try to do good, the system and structure might actually shape us and change us more than we change the system and structure. So I want to talk about this next slide here, where I want to talk about how systems and structures can be very dysfunctional, but we've got to deal with the internalized narratives that often fuel these systems and structures. So let's think about the most horrid institution and structure in American history, the institution of slavery. Completely dehumanizing. Horrible, horrible situation to own human lives and to strip them of all their rights. It is the most horrific institution without parallel in American history. But we can rejoice that broken system of slavery was confronted by a civil war, by the Emancipation Proclamation, by the 13th Amendment, and we had that intrusion, that blue line there, that tore down the system of slavery. So we can take that first circle and put an X through it, because that system was torn down. But what we fail to realize is the power of internalization, which means that there were narratives that were formed that was fueling the system, and people were internalizing these narratives. And because we didn't deal with the fuel that fueled the system, the fuel found a different way to express itself. So even though slavery, the system, was torn down, what had gotten internalized in our society was the assumption that whites were superior to blacks, that whites held a superior position than all the other people in our society. And that was the baseline narrative, internalized story within American slavery. White bodies were superior to black bodies, so you can take a black body and make him into a slave. Well, that narrative wasn't dealt with. So if that narrative was fueling the system of slavery, and you didn't deal with that fuel, then a new system will come up that the fuel will continue to fuel, the narrative. So what happens after slavery? For a short period of time, you have Reconstruction, but not long after, you have Jim Crow. And Jim Crow is almost as effective as slavery. It disenfranchises African Americans. African Americans can't vote. African Americans are reduced economically into a particular segment of society. So because you never dealt with the fuel that fueled the first dysfunctional system, even after destroying the first dysfunctional system, when you left the fuel there, it just created a new system that kept the fuel going. It internalized a dysfunction within the system. Now, we know the story as well, that a civil rights movement occurs, there are Voting Rights Acts, and it tears down the system of Jim Crow. But we didn't deal with the fuel, the narrative that had been internalized, and it kept going on its merry way, and now it created a new system that is also almost as effective as the old system. And this is the new Jim Crow. And the new Jim Crow, to some extent, has been just as effective as the old Jim Crow, which was almost as effective as the system of slavery, because the fuel keeps all of these systems going. Even if one falls, another one takes its place. If one falls, another one takes its place. So think about the impact of the new Jim Crow. If you've read any work by Michelle Alexander, there's a phenomenal work called Rethinking Incarceration by my former student, Dominic Gilliard. Had a phenomenal work from a Christian perspective on the issue of incarceration. And what you see in that new Jim Crow is, again, almost as effective as the old Jim Crow. So process this with me. What is the voting district or voting jurisdiction that has the most number of highest percentage of African Americans? Washington, D.C. It's about 97, 98% African American. How many representatives do they have in the federal government? Zero. Now, what's the second most populous state or jurisdiction with the percentage of African Americans? It happens to be the state of Mississippi. It's about 45%, according to certain reviews, about 45% African American. They have 6 representatives to the federal government. How many are African American? 1. 1 out of 6 representing 1 out of 2. How is that possible when we supposedly live in an era where one person equals one vote? Well, it's possible because of gerrymandering. They have gerrymandered these states so horrifically that you get one African American district and the rest are created in a way so that they would never have an African American representatives from the rest of the state of Mississippi. Also, you have the new Jim Crow, which is mass incarceration, and once you do that, you disenfranchise hundreds of thousands of black men from ever voting again. So, and then you get voter suppression. You create different ways to suppress the African American vote, and you end up with one of the most populous states of the African American population underrepresented in the federal government. So the new Jim Crow is almost as effective as the old Jim Crow, which was almost as effective as slavery, because the fuel that drove this narrative is still in play. There are still assumptions about the superiority of white bodies, white minds, white culture, white institutions, white theology, over and against non-white theology. And if we're going to talk about diversity, cultural competency, we can keep tearing down systems. We've got to deal with the narrative that fuels the system in the first place. We've got to deal with these underlying internalized messages that actually keep fueling even every time around. You can tear it down, but it keeps coming up with new systems. Let me give you an example of this. And this is a more subtle example, but is there an assumption of that narrative that says that white language, white culture, white bodies, the product of white minds, white theology, is superior to all other forms? And I encountered this in one of the first textbooks I read in seminary. And the book was talking about 3 different types of culture. And it said there's a high culture and there's a low culture. High culture was defined as ballet, Shakespeare, Rembrandt, Bach, Beethoven, Aristotle, Downton Abbey. No, the last one I made up. So kind of anything associated with European culture was considered high culture. Then the author said there's also a low culture. And that was actually kind of the other end of the spectrum within Western society. It was pop culture. It was Britney Spears. Well, okay, maybe I might agree with this one. Britney Spears and television sitcoms and popular movies, pop culture. This was considered low culture. Now, after these categories were created, the author realized what? He left out 99.9% of the cultures in the world. So he created a third category called folk culture. And into the category of folk culture, he threw everything else in. That included African American spirituals, Native American rituals, Korean fan dancing and drumming. Anything that didn't fall into European high culture or European low culture, American low culture, got dumped into folk culture. And the implication of his writings was folk culture is inferior to the high Western white European culture. In fact, the language that he used was high culture can sustain virtue for longer periods of time, whereas folk culture can do it only for short periods of time. So folk culture, like, African American spirituals, that's folk culture. It's not as good. It's not as spiritual. It's not as high and positive as a 4-part harmony European hymn. So there is an inherent assumption of an inherent superiority of high culture over and against folk culture. And if we're talking about developing cultural competency, we're talking about engaging a diverse world, these narratives have to be dealt with. These assumptions, these internalized messages of certain cultures are superior to mine, certain cultures are superior to that culture. That narrative has to be addressed, otherwise we're going to keep building systems that are perpetuating this dysfunctional narrative. I'll give you an example of this. You can't fix a broken narrative with more of the same broken narrative. So if part of the problem and the danger of not being able to do multicultural ministry is this narrative of white superiority, then you can't fix that with more white superiority. You can't fix that with the same old message that fulfills the negative narrative in the first place. Here's the example that I can offer you. Several years ago, there was a huge Super Bowl launched ad campaign. It was called the Red Campaign. They launched it on Super Bowl Sunday, like a 2-minute ad, featured Bono and Brad Pitt and Tom Hanks. Kind of all the A-listers got up there and talked about the Red Campaign. The goal of the Red Campaign was to raise funds to address the problem of AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa, which I am absolutely 100% behind. We should do that. We should have greater compassion for those who are struggling and dealing with the AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa, no question about it. But here's the problem. They spent $10 million in ads to raise awareness about the Red Campaign. They did it for 10 years. Ad Weekly, which tracks the impact and the effectiveness of advertising, researched this and found that $10 million spent over 10 years, do you know how much money they raised at the end of 10 years? $10 million. So they netted $0 in terms of this huge Super Bowl-driven ad campaign. Now, what were you supposed to do in the Red Campaign to stop the AIDS pandemic in Africa? What was the thing that you could do in order to help the AIDS pandemic in Africa? You were supposed to buy, no, not even donate, you were supposed to buy a red shirt from Target, a red iPod, and a red tag Levi's jean, which is every Levi's jean. But the whole thing was there are going to be products you can buy, and a percentage of what you buy is going to go to address the AIDS pandemic in Africa. After 10 years and a $10 million startup budget, they raised $10 million, netting $0. Now, over those 10 years, who actually made all the money? Target, Levi's, Apple made billions of dollars as we foolishly rushed out to get our little red iPods, not realizing that 10 years later, none of that money got to sub-Saharan Africa to address the AIDS pandemic. Now, I'm going to say something fairly controversial. To some extent, we have a cure for AIDS, to some extent. Now, it's not a cure per se, but there is a way to deal with the AIDS pandemic. How do I know this? 27 years ago or so, I'm a seminary student. And I remember being a poor seminary student, we used to go to a Chili's that was right near my seminary. And the best thing about Chili's is they used to have 50-cent fajitas. And you could just buy all the fajitas. They expected you to drink. We would get water and get $2.50 worth of fajitas. Best deal in town. The waitress hated us because they wanted us to buy like $5 beers. We got water and 50-cent fajitas. So I remember this very vividly because a group of seminary students were eating our 50-cent fajitas and our glass of water. And a news, there's TVs all over the room. A news flash comes on, and it's Magic Johnson. What's he doing on TV? Y'all remember Magic Johnson? You're in LA, of course you remember Magic Johnson. Magic Johnson, arguably, I'm from Chicago, arguably one of the greatest basketball players of all time. Michael and Magic. We can have that argument. Michael, Magic, LeBron, okay, that's a different argument. However, that day, he announced, 27 years ago, that what? He was HIV positive. And he was going to retire from basketball. Now, be honest with me. If you remember that moment, I remember that moment vividly. Again, what was your first thought about Magic Johnson? He's dead. 3 months, 6 months, he's dead. I love the guy. I'm so sad that he's going to die. 27 years later, anybody seen Magic? He's looking a little chunky, actually. He's looking really healthy. He has lived 27 years with an AIDS-positive diagnosis. And he's gotten wealthier and healthier over those 27 years. Now, he hasn't gotten rid of it, but it has effectively found a cure because there is a cocktail of medicine that actually prevents the AIDS from becoming a deadly disease. The problem then is not that we can't help people with AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa and we need more research to do that. The problem is actually the greed and materialism of the pharmaceutical company that wants to charge someone in Africa the same amount they're charging Magic Johnson with his $1 million health insurance policy. The problem is not enough money for research. The problem is the greed of those who have the cure but refuse to share that at a cost that is affordable to those in Africa. So can you fight greed with more greed? Can you fight the problem of materialism that is perpetuating the AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa with more materialism? We can't fight the narrative with more of the same narrative. We can't fight the assumptions of the superiority of white culture and white ideas and thoughts with more ideas that emerge from that culture. You can't fight a narrative with the same narrative that created it in the first place. So what we need to do is create counter narratives, counter narratives. That's why I'm a little bit nervous about the colorblind approach. Now, right now, when we talk about multiculturalism, there's kind of two approaches to this. One is what we call the racial justice approach, which takes the history of racism in America very seriously, and the colorblind approach, which actually says we're all the same in the body of Christ. When you come into the doors of the church, you check your culture at the door. And I would say that that is the ultimate expression of privilege. And I would also say, and I've said this many times to kind of pastors who say, I'm at a colorblind church. And he said, why would you inflict a disability intentionally upon your entire congregation? Right? Colorblindness is a disability. It prevents you from doing certain things, right? So one of my favorite movies is a movie called Little Miss Sunshine. I don't know if you've seen it. There's a really, really sad scene where one of the characters is a young boy, teenage boy, who wants to be a military pilot, Air Force pilot. And in order to prepare him for that, he takes this vow of silence and refuses to talk until he can become an Air Force pilot and get into the Air Force Academy. On this road trip that this family takes, he finds out what? That he's colorblind. Sorry, I didn't mean to spoil that movie for you, but gave the ending away, sorry. And he's devastated because this disability will prevent him from doing what he wants to do, which is to be an Air Force pilot. So when we say we want our church to be colorblind, you are saying we want a particular disability to inflict all of us, and we're going to be a better church for it? That's not how that works. Now, I'm not giving you a theology of disability here. I'm giving you a theology of colorblindness. That colorblindness is intentionally inflicting on the church a widespread disability that actually does not serve the church. So the way I've kind of talked about it is in terms of how do we change the narrative around this is there's a narrative of how multiculturalism is done in kind of larger American society. The first narrative is what we call the melting pot. Yeah, you all remember the melting pot? It's a very big theme in American society for many, many years. If you remember the TV show, The Great American Melting Pot, it was a Schoolhouse Rock 3-minute show on Saturday mornings. And it showed a picture of this boiling pot of hot water. And it traumatized me because they kept throwing people into that hot water and they were melting them away. You got thrown into the pot as an Irish person and as a Korean and as a Filipino, but you got melted away with all those things and you came out cream of mushroom. So there was this kind of assumption that that's what America was going to be. It was going to be this melting pot. And as one of my Native American friends still says quite often, we natives don't melt, so don't keep trying to melt us after all these years. So that kind of actually perspective was abandoned. So we don't do the melting pot anymore. And then there was a second image that came up, and that was the salad bowl. You all remember the salad bowl? And I like this image a little bit more. The salad bowl is where you get all these different vegetables in a bowl. You go to like a Sizzler. Do they still have those around? The Sizzlers are one of these kind of all-you-can-eat buffets, and and they have this long line of vegetables, and you just kind of pile all these vegetables on your plate, and that's a really nice image of a salad bowl, and that makes sense. So if you get like romaine lettuce and iceberg lettuce and cherry tomatoes and all that kind of basic stuff, but you can add a jalapeno to that salad bowl. Amen. You can add turnip greens to that salad bowl. You can even add kimchi to that salad bowl. And look at the wonderful variety that we have in this salad bowl, which is fantastic. But what do we do with that salad? We get a huge vat of creamy ranch, and we just pour that whole thing all over our salad. And at the end of the day, we end up with something that doesn't taste like jalapenos or greens or kimchi. You put enough creamy ranch on kimchi, it even stops tasting like kimchi. It tastes like creamy ranch. And that is what passes for multi-ethnicity in many of our church contexts. Oh, look around. We've got all these different looking people. We got all these people from all over the world and all over the city and all over the cultures around us. But everybody is covered with creamy ranch, and everybody tastes the same and acts the same and interacts the same. And that's what passes. So I don't know what the next image is. I love food, so I'm thinking, all-you-can-eat buffet? I don't know. Where you can just get all the different varieties and you can experience all of that. Whatever that image is, we can't use the old narratives to fix the problems in our world right now. So I want to offer you a couple of challenges. One is that the counter-narrative of lament is one of the most significant places where we begin. And what I said this morning was that one of the key aspects of lament and the book of Lamentations is that it listens to other voices. This is very significant. It listens to other voices. The privileged voice of Jeremiah moves out of the way so that other voices can be heard. This is something that I would challenge you as, especially if you're a student, but pastors as well, that how well are you listening to other voices? Because you can listen to the voices of victory and triumph, which is a lot of what Western culture moves towards, but you also need to hear the stories of suffering and lament, which is oftentimes the immigrant communities and the refugee communities. And so the tendency when we hear other voices is to say, well, one side is the good side and the other side is the insufficient side. So the work of Walter Brueggemann has been very instructive for me. Brueggemann talks about the theology of celebration and the theology of suffering. And the theology of celebration is when people have a lot of good things. They've been blessed by God. They sing, yes, Lord, joy to the world. All these good things have happened to them. That's the theology of celebration. Most of us in the West, and in the US, Canada, North America, and Europe, probably operate more in the theology of celebration because we have good things that we have in the world. But there's another part of the story, which is the theology of suffering. So celebration is when you sing hymns and songs of praise. But suffering is when you don't have those good things. In a place of suffering, you lament. But in a story and a narrative and a culture where everything is celebratory and victorious and we're going to win and we're going to get so tired of winning, all of these narratives generate a perspective that that's what God intended, when actually lament is as much a part of the worship of Israel as praise and celebration. Right? So when you look at the Old Testament and the Psalms, 60% of our 60% of our hymns or psalms are psalms of praise and celebration. But 40% of our psalms are psalms of lament. So not quite 50-50, but certainly fairly equitable in the distribution of hymns of praise and psalms of lament. The typical Baptist hymnal, according to Glenn Pemberton's work on this, is about 85% hymns of celebration and about 15% hymns of lament. And that's just what's in there. It doesn't mean that people sing 85%, 15%. In fact, what they found was that in liturgical tradition, even if the lament psalm is there, they skip it. They don't sing it. Even if the lament psalm is supposed to be read, they skip it. And they sing a happier song or a happier hymn. I did a similar study with CCLI, which is the contemporary worship list of all the most popular songs. So every year they publish the top 100 most popular contemporary worship songs. They actually keep a good record of this because you're supposed to let them know what songs you sing when you project your songs. I went through all the lyrics and titles of the songs. Actually, it was my TA. That's why you have TAs. So my TA went through and read all the lyrics and all the titles of the songs. And we discovered together, and I went through some of them as well, that about 5 out of the top 100 most popular worship songs are probably songs about lament, 5 or 10. And I'm being very generous about lament. The song is, I cry out. Yeah, lament. Rest of the song is, I cry out for joy. Nope, got to still use it. Cry is in there. We're going to count that as a lament. So even with that, maybe 5, maybe 10 of our worship, typical top 100 most popular worship songs. So it's showing a narrative that is absent in most of our church contexts. We have gravitated towards one side of the story and have ignored the other side of the story. And Brueggemann argues that if you don't have celebration and suffering together, you only have a part of the gospel message. Because it's like having the resurrection without the cross. It's like having the incarnation without the crucifixion. You can't have those. You have to have both sides of the story, and so you have to have the celebration as well as the suffering. If you really want the gospel message, it has to be both. And part of lament is reintroducing some of these elements. And that's why it is so exciting to be in the United States right now on that level, because the immigrant, the refugee, the African American, the minority, quote unquote, minority churches of ethnic minority people of color, the narrative is of suffering. The stories are of lament. And if the dominant culture is triumphalistic, we need a corrective to that triumphalistic culture and a balancing that actually comes from a counter-narrative of lament. That's why I say that we've got to hear all the voices. That's part of the theology of lament. It's part of the theology of a cross-cultural, multicultural ministry. I'll explain it another way. I had a good friend who's a white couple in the south side of Chicago. And they've done multicultural ministry for years. They planted a church in an African-American neighborhood. And they were going to do a cross-cultural adoption, a white couple adopting an African-American child. So in Chicago, you actually have to go through some significant training. They don't just let anybody, adopt cross-culturally. They actually do some training. So it's actually a room like this. They get people in a room with round tables, and everybody gets a clear bowl. Think of your glass and a little larger version of that. And in the middle, not just clear marbles, but they have all these different colored marbles. And they start asking a series of questions. So they say, the last 5 TV shows you watched, what ethnic group was the most prominently featured? The last 5 books you've read, who are the authors? What ethnic group were the authors? The furniture in your house, what culture does that represent? And then do the corresponding color of the marble that corresponds to that. I started expanding that to say, when you have, and seminaries often do this, and universities often do this, the pictures of famous people in your seminary, whose pictures are they? Who's seen as the key people in the seminary's history? It's probably old dead white man, to be blunt with you. So the questions are asking, what do you surround yourself with? And my friend, again, Southside pastor, has worked in the African community for years. As they went through this whole question, he realized he had filled his bowl with all white marbles, 50 white marbles. And then they say, I want you to take the color of the child you're about to adopt, put him in the middle of that bowl, and you have 1 black marble in a sea of white marbles. That is sometimes what passes for multiculturalism. We got the 1 black guy to come to our church. We got the 1 Asian guy to come to our church. We got the 1 Latino family to come to our church. But everything else in your culture has no reflection on the group that you've invited to come to your church. It reflects a particular cultural dynamic and milieu. Again, can you change a narrative with more of the same narrative? So I'm going to offer you this kind of option here. And if we can go to, I think it might be the last slide. I did some work with Ronald Byrd when I was an undergrad. And Ronald Byrd was my sociology professor. It was one of my majors when I was a college student. And Ronald Byrd is a very smart guy. He's a brilliant sociologist. He's so brilliant and so smart, in fact, he realized there's no money in academics. So he left the academy, gave up tenure at Columbia University, and started working for Wall Street. And what he did was he went to Wall Street to try to help them, this is about 20 years ago, to try to help them understand how to raise up leaders in a globalized economy, right? So, by the way, if you want to read some good books on cross-cultural competency, most of those books came out of the business world 10, 20 years before they came out in the Christian world. Because the business world saw this way ahead of time. They said, we're doing business not just in the US, but we got to go to Europe, and we got to go to Japan, and we got to go to Africa, and we got to go to Latin America. This is a globalized economy. We need leaders who are culturally competent, not just in the US, not just among Europeans, but all over the world. They've got to develop a certain level of cultural competency. So Ronald Byrd was asked to come in to say, how can we develop key leaders to actually work in this multicultural global world that we're living in? So he looked at 2 different theories. The first theory is called social capital theory. And this is actually popularized by a Harvard professor by the name of Robert Putnam. And Putnam wrote a book called Bowling Alone. Fascinating work. I actually got to have dinner with him one time, and I asked him about some of this stuff. And he's actually not a sociologist. He's actually a political scientist who was examining the decline of civic society. And what he noted was that the level of league bowling mirrored the level of civic society, such as that's declining, we've seen the decline in participation in churches, voting decline. All of these indicators of civic involvement was seeing this sharp decline. So he writes about how can we rebuild society through the concept of social capital. Now, what happens in social capital is that you do a favor for me, then I owe you a favor, and it creates a bond between the two of us. So here's an example. I lived in New England for many years. And New Englanders, you don't know this, you all are wimpy Californians. But in New England, we have this thing called snow. And when it snows, we get out there and we shovel that snow, right? I mean, we are hardy New Englanders. It's 6 feet high. We get out there with a little shovel and we shovel that thing out. So when I got to the Midwest, I get to Chicago, which is just as cold as New England. I was so embarrassed at all these wimpy neighbors of mine. Because what did they have? Yeah, snow blowers. What is wrong with you people? Can't you get a shovel and just shovel your way out of the... No, they had to have these snow blowers. And I'm like, I can't believe this. Snowblowers. And I refused to buy a snowblower. I had my shovel. But what happened was I went away. I actually came here. I was speaking at Fuller Seminary. I came here to California, and it was November. I said, yeah, nothing's going to happen for a couple of days away. And of course, what happened? One of the biggest snowstorms hits the Midwest. A snowstorm hits the Midwest. I got a call from my wife like 7 in the morning and said, I wanted to ask you, why don't we have a snowblower? And I gave, hey, New Englanders, we're hardy people. We shovel our own snow. We don't need a snowblower. That's great. You're in 70-degree sunny California, and it snowed about a foot here last night, so what am I going to do with all the snow with just a broken shovel in our driveway? Now, what happens? My neighbor, Brian Morehouse, Irish Catholic family, lived, actually, he's about my age, but he grew up in the house that he lives in right now. Lifelong Midwesterner, lifelong Chicagoan, and he has a snowblower. So what does he do? He clears my walk for me. He comes over there and moves all the snow out of the way because he saw these stupid New Englanders not having a snowblower, so he comes over and fixes that for me. Now, what has he earned with me? Social capital. Social capital. That's how churches often operate too, right? So someone is sick, you bring over all these meals. That's actually what really works well in immigrant churches, because immigrant communities know that if someone is hurting their community, everybody rallies around. Everybody brings financial support. Everybody brings some kind of food dish over. That's a really wonderful community sense. It builds social capital. It creates a very strong bond, and it creates healthy churches because you have social capital. But here's the interesting thing about social capital. There's a theory that social capital actually doesn't translate as well cross-culturally. And this is where Byrt's social analysis comes in. What happens is that social capital does not actually create innovative leaders. And this is what Byrd was looking at. So Byrd did this thing called cluster analysis. So he goes into a business, and he asks them questions about who do you have lunch with, who do you spend weekends with, who do you go golfing with, who do you have your breaks with, and found that these communities tend to cluster, right? So salespeople cluster together. Engineers working on one project cluster together. Engineers working on a different project cluster together. So that's what you're seeing here. You've got a cluster around one task, a cluster around a different task, and a cluster around different tasks, etc. So you see all these clusters. Now, social capital theory says the best leaders come from smack dab in the middle of the cluster. That's kind of intuitively makes sense, right? Because that leader probably has the best network of social capital in that cluster. So usually, the leader emerges in the middle of that cluster, comes out and says, I'm now the leader because I have all these relationships within my cluster. And that's oftentimes the way we raise up leadership within a cluster with a particular value system. However, what Byrd found is that they were actually not the best leaders. The most innovative leaders were not in the center of the cluster. The best cross-cultural leaders were not at the center of the clusters. Where were they? They were on the edges. And what were they doing? They were building relationships not only in their cluster, but they were building relationships in other clusters. And they were brokering ideas, relationships, values, all these different things. They were going to another cluster, bringing it back, and actually creating innovation. So here's the way I experienced this. I grew up in a Korean-American church that was very much a Korean-American church, and I grew up in a time when there were not as many Korean churches and youth groups around. So what turns out during my time as a youth member is that we had like 5 speakers that would come to every Korean youth retreat in all of the United States. And we all also had the same group of songs that we sang because we were kind of operating within this small cluster, and that's where all the ideas stayed within that cluster. So the same 5 speakers would rotate every 5 years. The same songs would be sung at every Korean youth group. It was a closed system. Now what happened is that I grew up in that system, but I went away to college. And I went away to college in New York, and I joined InterVarsity, which is a multi-ethnic campus ministry. And it was when I was at InterVarsity in Columbia that I visited my first African-American church. It was when I was there that we went to this wonderful all citywide InterVarsity gathering. It was a very diverse gathering. Then I went to a summer camp or a week-long camp where I encountered all these different expressions of worship and faith and life. It was absolutely fantastic. So after a year of this experience in InterVarsity, I come back to my hometown and my home church, and they're planning the summer retreat. They asked me, hey, can you come along? You worked with youth before. You were a member of our youth group last year. Can you come and help us plan things? And now who becomes the smartest guy in the room with the greatest ideas in that room? Me. Now, I say, hey, have we thought about bringing in this speaker? I said, we don't know who that is. Well, I know who that is. I think she'll be a fantastic person to speak to the youth. Have we thought about doing this game instead of the game we play every single year, every single time? Have we thought about singing some new songs that I learned because we kind of sing the same 5 songs every year? And I'm the smartest guy in the room, and then I say, where are you getting these wonderful ideas? It's the Holy Spirit. But what am I doing? I am simply brokering ideas from other clusters. So if you want to be an innovative leader, you've got to hear the other voices. You've got to be in other clusters. You've got to move in other communities, and that's where the most innovative leaders come from. So I can give you some thoughts about how do you develop multiculturalism in your church. I would say the first step is, as a leader, as a pastor, develop multiculturalism in your own life and develop these competencies where you yourself are in places where your experience is something new, something different, and it challenges you to bring innovation from different groups to different places, and that is a genuine form of multi-ethnic ministry. Thank you so much for your time today.